So Joanna, you are one of the members of the Decolonial Aesthetics Working Group at the UdK. Would you maybe just talk a little bit about how it came about and what your main ideas were with this group?
Well, this group is a part of what was a Graduiertenkolleg, that is in English, the name is a research training group that was funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. I don't really know what the name is in English. And basically it's part of the research of the colleague. In this research group, basically the central idea was to think about the co-constitution between art and knowledge, questioning not only the distribution of knowledge that happens through art, but also the fact that arts can construct by themselves non-discursive, for example, knowledge, and how this would happen. And part of these research questions led to thinking about the politics of knowledge, which related very closely to some of the work of some of the researchers in the group. So, for example, Maya Figge, who was a postdoc at the Kolleg in 2017, she's somewhere else right now continuing her research in another context. She was working very closely with questions of the definition of modernity and thinking it through film. And she was one of the really strong initiators of this group to think about the co-constitution of art and knowledge within the context of post-colonial practices, post-colonial theories, decolonial practices, and anti-colonial positions. And from then on, that was more or less 2017, I think, when there was a real emphasis on this. A small group inside of the Kolleg started working together on those questions, basically as a group that met to read, discuss texts, look at exhibitions, look at works of art, and discuss them within this context.
And could you give some examples of some texts or exhibitions and artworks that were the most inspiring to you when you formed this group?
Well, of course, we did a first review of what was the literature that was there and who were the people who were working on this. You know, we didn't invent actually the name decolonial aesthetics. We had a really big discussion because there were people way before us thinking and talking and writing about it. So we thought about, okay, decolonial aesthetics and decolonial practices. So of course we read lots of the stuff that Walter Mignolo has written. But we also went beyond and tried to think about, okay, what other connections we're talking about positions, of course, that maybe have dealt with the same power structures, with the same notions of epistemic violence, but under other names, you know. So anti-racist works. We read then, of course, lots of Latin American thinkers, but also British art authors. We read Afrofuturism, different authors. And then we saw lots of exhibitions that happened in Berlin at the time. So we were looking at this not necessarily as examples of decolonial work, but we're looking at what was happening and seeing it through the lens. So at that point, that was a long time ago, maybe a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, there was an Ana Mendieta exhibition that we went to see and think through her works through this lens. But we didn't really look at what works are exemplary for a decolonial aesthetics. And I would very much that was always my personal position within the group, you know, categorize something as that is the colonial aesthetics and that is not the colonial aesthetics. I think the methodologies, the strategies are very different depending on the context, depending on the regional context, depending on the historical context, and a lot of the times there are overlaps in the works. They're just defined differently. central to the whole idea is thinking about how to undo a lot of the notions that define how we see and how we define what art is.
I would be especially interested in the question how you think these aesthetics are also connected to certain structures of feelings. When we talk about colonial aesthetics, but then also decolonial aesthetics. Was that something you discussed in the working group as well?
We didn't directly really talk directly about affect. Of course, people like Sarah Ahmed are very important. And I am going to go back to Mignolo just because in Germany he has been so important in these definitions. We didn't really talk about feeling directly, but of course we are thinking about how the concept of art is constructed. Thinking about, of course, and the notion of the beautiful and the sublime, yeah? And then you get immediately to the capacity to be the capacity to feel moved by art, thinking about the sublime in Kant, for example. So one of the premises is, if you read this philosophical aesthetics, you see that slowly this notion of being able to be moved by the beautiful and the sublime gets more and more attached as a European capacity to get moved to that. So the capacity to be moved by the beautiful and the sublime in non-European context and in colonized populations, it's kind of gets relegated to a second level of, ritual practice, festivity, their relationship to the natural world, but gets slowly removed to that idea of art as an autonomous and non-functional subject. And in that respect is very, very, very closed because then of course you have a certain expectation of more developed sense to be able to be moved by the beautiful and the sublime through art, in a colonial structure where the people at the top of the ladder, have, and then the people at the bottom of the ladder don't, So it's this capacity to be moved that is also kind of really closely intertwined with this power structures and the expectation of what is art and what is not. One of the really easy examples to follow is a painting. Yeah, it's a piece of fabric. Yeah, let's say a piece of fabric with oil paints. Yeah, a pottery. It's a piece of ceramic also painted with oil paints, and one is. One could be considered art as a painting, and in the context in which you show it is a museum of art, and the other, the pottery, gets exhibited in an ethnographic museum. Yeah, so it's not art; it's a functional piece that was used by someone to serve water. So even though these two objects in themselves, the materials that make them are not so different. The concept of what they mean, what they are, and what the populations that create are capable of doing gets divided into categories that reinforce these structures of power that are ingrained, in these colonial structures.
Super interesting. Maybe one last question, because you also mentioned that you co-edited a volume that's digitally available.
Yes.
Is there any other output of the working group that we can read or that we can watch, or are there any activities planned in the future? How does your vision for the working group look like?
Yeah. Well, this whole thing started before the pandemic hit, and when the pandemic hit, then the work of the working group was made more difficult. It wasn't so easy to meet, and then we started meeting less, which means the last real output that happened was this edition online in a publication that is also part of the Graduiertenkolleg. It's called Wissen der Künste.de, and there that is the I think it's the number 8. It's called On Decolonial Deferrals. As an output, that would be the one, because there were a lot of internal meetings, just meeting to have a conversation, read some texts together. So in terms of output, that was it. And in terms of looking into the future, what we did was invite lots of different guests. After that, we had a couple of workshops, for example, one on cacophony and sonic strategies of disturbance, I would say, with an artist, a Brazilian artist, Jota Mombasa, or with Make Pereira, who did a workshop on movement and yogaton. That also happened online and as part of the work of the working group. And after that, there hasn't been any plans for what's going to happen next. So it is open-ended. The Graduiertenkolleg finishes at the UdK. It's closing this year after 9 years of research. And that was the question: do we want to continue? If we want to continue, how do we want to continue? Does it have to change? Does the structure have to change, from this close group of people to something more open?
I hope you find a way to make it happen and to continue this work that I think is very important. Thanks so much, Juana.
Thank you.